Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. The Nehru Center is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucenter.org.uk. You don't need to write them down, they will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Center. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Center, that's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel, again, the Nehru Center. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we are putting up for you. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Namaste, Jai Hind. Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi, and as you heard in the introduction, I am the director of the Nehru Center. And today I get the privilege to host the launch of a book of an author who I'm a fan of. And this is the second of a duology. This was the first book, which we had launched at the Nehru Center as well, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy. This was, of course, from 1883 to 1924. Veer Savarkar's life from then to then. And this is the new book. This is the book that we are launching today. And Vikram Sampath, the author, has joined us from Bangalore. If he can be brought up on stage, please.
Hello, Amish. Good afternoon, good evening.
Good evening to you as well, Vikram. And I have been told that it is a stormy evening in Bangalore.
Yes.
So a stormy evening for a stormy book. But the reason I'm saying that to all the Nehru Center viewers is that just in case there is any internet trouble or electricity outrage in Bangalore due to the storm, Vikram will quickly come back with a phone. So you guys, if that happens, don't switch off, don't turn the dial, just hang on. Vikram will come back immediately while I will keep you busy. And Omkar Dope has just joined. He's the fastest finger first with his comment saying, "Let's go." All right, let's
Yes.
go, Omkar. So before we begin, I'll do the formalities, Vikram. If I can just read out your introduction, and before we begin with the book. So Vikram Sampath, Bangalore-based historian, is the author of 5 acclaimed books: Splendors of Royal Mysore, My Name is Gohar Jan, and The Voice of Veena, S. Balachandra, a biography, and of course, Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past in 1883-1924, and his latest, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy, 1924 onwards. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gohar Jan. The book has also been adapted as a play, Gohar, by Lilith Dubey, the wonderful thespian, and is being adapted to a Hindi movie by Ashutosh Gowarikar. Vikram has a doctorate in history and music from the University of Queensland in Australia and is a former senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. We just share the same name. We are not sister organizations. Nehru Center, Nehru Memorial. An engineer mathematician from BITS Pilani and an MBA in finance from SP Jain Institute of Management, Mumbai. He is also a trained Carnatic vocalist and has established the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound archive for vintage recordings, and is the founder director of the Bangalore Literature Festival, Indic Talks Festival, and the Z Group's Earth, a cultural fest. We are going to do the launch of your book. We have a nice video for it. But before that, if I can ask a fun question. You're an engineer mathematician from BITS Pilani, an MBA from SP Jain Institute, and you're an author and musician now. Did banking lose a wonderful potential banker?
Coming from someone like you who has a very similar profile as mine, Amish, a mathematician, an MBA, a banker. So I think it's good that the banks lost both of us. Some kind of gain to we would hope presumptuously, to the world of culture and literature and history.
and
I hope we're making our small little difference in a very small way.
and presumably a benefit to the world of banking as well. Some banks will not go bankrupt.
Perhaps, yeah. Given how bad I was in arithmetic, I think it's really Citibank's gain.
So Vikram, before we begin, as you know, this is the online world, so we don't have the pleasure of ripping
Yes,
apart wrapping paper. So we have put together an online video for you
that's
and
so
your
lovely.
book. If
How
we can
lovely.
do the launch of the book as well, the London launch.
How beautiful was that? Thank you. Thank you.
All,
That was beautiful.
all credit to the team. Vineet, our wonderful tech guy at the back, and this is the
Amazing.
photo moment, holding both the books
Yes.
together, one and two, the duology. You guys do check it out. I'd strongly recommend it. Wonderful read. Um, so Vikram, I'm just jumping in straight away, and perhaps a slightly provocative question straight away.
Wow.
Was
First,
Savarkar a British stooge?
was a googly.
Was Veer Savarkar a British stooge? Many people accuse him of that.
First of all, thank you, Amish. It's always such a pleasure to one speak to you and also speak, at the Nehru Center. I still have such fond memories of our previous conversation at the launch of the earlier volume. And as much as we want to do it in person, I think at least the online space allows for this kind of an interaction, which is good. And I think in more ways than one, it's very coincidental that we're having a launch on Savarkar in London, where the very city that branded him as one of the most dangerous dangerous category criminals. And in the 5 years that he spent in London as a law student, the kind of seditious activities that he did for the complete liberation of India, for which he was deported out of the shores of London and taken away and dragged away to Kalapani, where he spent 12 horrific years. In fact, initially it was a 50-year long term, the highest, probably the harshest punishment, other than, of course, execution, that anybody got, of 2 life imprisonments, accounting for 25 plus 25, 50 long years. A young man who was a lawyer who'd come there to study with dreams in his eyes, but also dreams of a completely free motherland, which is what made the British so petrified of him. And Churchill's notings on all the papers that at any cost we want this man extradited back to India and tried without any jury, without a very very unfair kind of a trial that was put out for him to ensure that he gets out of mainland India. Now, to your provocative question, as I said, you're starting the show with a googly, which I hope I don't get, duck out for. But,
No,
but
you won't. You're a master blaster.
I think this is this time and again, Amish, as you rightly said, this keeps coming up. That someone Anirudh Yadav also says the city that calls him Indian patriot and philosopher. That's very true. His the India House in Highgate in London, which has that blue plaque, from the London Corporation, still calls him an Indian patriot and philosopher. No matter if the politics of India at least calls him the kind of things that you just mentioned, the accusation of him being a stooge. In 1924, Savarkar, and this is where this volume begins, of his release from prison after spending 14 harrowing years. And most of these prisoners, they had to sign some kind of an undertaking to the British government that they would not take part in politics for a stipulated amount of time, or they would remain confined to a particular place. So Savarkar was actually confined to the district of Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. And the initial undertaking he had given was that he would remain away from politics, active politics, for 5 years. So 1924 to 1929. But every time, his petition came up for a review after the end of the 5-year term, and then 2 years, 2 years. The British government would always, in the review, say that we don't trust this man. His antecedents are very dubious. His activities are not something that we can trust. And so, what was initially 5 years actually extended to 13 long years. So, from 1924 to 1937, and it was only in 1937 that he gets completely released, and that too under pressure. The British government released him because 1937 you had governments being formed in India after the Government of India Act, and the Bombay government that was being formed there, though it was of the Congress, they put in a lot of pressure on the British, saying unless you release Savarkar, we will not even form the government. So it was under that kind of intense pressure that the British actually finally consented to release him, completely, and allow him to join mainstream politics. So the very fact that somebody who was around, just for 5 years, captivity extends to 13 years, and their unwillingness to let him go shows that he was not a stooge. Because if he were a stooge, and if he were someone who was, as they say, a spy of the British, was passing on secrets and all kinds of other allegations, the British would have actually made use of him. He was a useful person. He was a lawyer who was returned from London. He was an intelligent man. He was had scholarly abilities. So the British would have co-opted him into the system, and he would have probably been the Prime Minister of Bombay State when the government was formed there. The very fact that all through those 13 years, the British kept him under very, very strict surveillance. Every letter that went in and out of his house, every speech he made, he became a journalist, and so all his articles were under the scanner. He had to write under pseudonyms most of the time. His degrees were snatched away from him, his law degree as well as his graduate degree from Ferguson College in Pune. And so on paper, he was just a metric pass. So there were no way he could even earn a livelihood, which is why he took to journalism. He started this newspaper called Shraddhanand in honor of Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj, who was murdered in 1926. All of this, and also the oft repeated fact is that he got a pension from the British and so on. That too is such a misnomer, because most of the revolutionaries, political prisoners who were let out, including those in Bengal, it was a routine affair that they got pensions from the government, about 100 rupees a month, to ensure that they kind of rehabilitate their life. This was like bringing them back into the mainstream of public life, because most of them would not have had an opportunity to educate themselves, or their degrees would have been taken away and so on. So it was a common practice to give pensions to prisoners. As I said, the Bengal prisoners got about 100 rupees a month. And when Savarkar actually applied for it the first time in 1924, it was rejected. He actually got the pension only in 1929, when the first 5-year term of his captivity came to an end, and it came up for a review, and his release was curtailed. That was when he got the initial amount of pension, and that too was reduced from 100, which others were eligible for, and he also was, to only 60 rupees a month. And this was given only till 1937, till the time he was completely released. So only those 8 years that he was, the captivity was being increased, he got this pension. And the reason for the British all the time saying that they did not trust this man was that, despite being in captivity, all the three Savarkar brothers, including Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, his elder brother Baba Rao, and the younger brother Narayan Rao, they never relinquished their support to the underground revolutionary movement. And that's something I've traced in this volume. A very, very fascinating connections, cross connections between Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Sukhdev, Rajguru, Sachindranath Sanyal, Rash Bihari Bose, and eventually Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Durga Bhabhi, who comes and lives in Narayan Rao's house for a couple of days, and Narayan Rao's wife teaches her to wear a Maharashtrian sari, the 9-yard sari, and also Maharashtrian nat to disguise herself. And they do this Lamington shootout case in Bombay. So this constant, the fact that he was linked with the revolutionaries, and Baba Rao was raising funds for the revolutionaries, including for Chandrasekhar Azad. And just a day before Chandrasekhar Azad actually ends his life in Alfred Park in Allahabad, he and Baba Rao have a long confabulation in Kashi. in the house of a pandit there, and Baba Rao, gives him money because most of the revolutionaries, had a very very tough financial situation to deal with. There was no way to raise funds other than through people underground networks like this, or some of the princely states who were helping them, in their campaign. So, because of all of these reasons, he was constantly under surveillance. And as early as 1929, Amish, he writes these four articles in the Shraddhanand, almost prophetically, saying how India should make you. That first of all, he prophesizes that there is going to be a global conflict very soon, as he foresees it, and just like the First World War. This is exactly 1 decade before the Second World War broke out, and how, while in the First World War, India did not make use of the geopolitical opportunity it provided, the Second World War should be a chance where we should not let go of it and ensure India gets free from the British. He writes it in a pseudonym, but all these four articles I actually quote in the book as well. So somebody who's a stooge,
Yeah,
it's
would not
very
do on this.
explain why would he actually advocate or write about getting freedom, or write articles eulogizing Bhagat Singh or Ashfaqullah Khan and so many other revolutionaries. So it's a beaten horse, a dead horse which is flogged so many times. But then when you repeat a lie so many times, it just starts assuming the shape of truth. Unfortunately,
Yeah, correct. And you have me convinced, which is why I love the books. But if I push you with some of the arguments of those who keep flogging a dead horse,
yeah,
Veer Savarkar did oppose the Quit India movement.
yeah,
So
yeah.
how would you how
So
would you square that up?
yeah. So Amish, I think I've often said this, that we usually consider that there was only one freedom struggle which got us independence. I think there were multiple parallel streams right from even before 1857. You had tribal revolts in different parts of India. You had the sannyasi rebellions. You had the princely states which organized its sedition, what the British would have called sedition, culminating, of course, in the 1857, the first war of independence, as Savarkar coined the term after doing research sitting in London, in the British Library and the British archives there.
The
Uh,
British demoted it, calling it the sepoy mutiny. Apparently,
Beautifully. Yeah, yeah, very disparagingly. Now, from 1857 to 1946, when you had the final naval mutiny, constantly there was a unending stream of armed conflict, and which we are not told much about. We are often, fed this image that the revolutionary movement was just individual acts of bravery of some, young, hot-blooded men and women who just did some foolhardy of throwing a bomb at someone, shooting someone down, and so some of them got executed, some of them went to jail, and it's a footnote in our history books, or at the max a paragraph or so. But I think this unending stream of an armed, rebellion, armed, violent pushback and resistance, that is what caused the British every time to actually come up with reforms, come up with concessions, right from the Morley-Minto reforms to the the Montagu Chelmsford reforms to the Government of India Act, and eventually freedom, which came after the naval mutiny of 1946. Now, so the narrative is those who do not belong to the freedom struggle that we are fed, Quit India movement or whatever, they are the only ones who are freedom fighters. Everybody who did not belong to that stream are actually traitors, are actually people who are pro-British and all of that, which is, I think, being very, very unfair. And it assumes, as I said, a very monochromatic nature to our freedom movement itself. Now, if you dispassionately analyze, after 1930, the Dandi March and the civil disobedience movement of Gandhiji, and we had the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, where effectively all disobedience was shut down. And then Gandhiji himself went to the roundtable conferences to negotiate with the British. 1935 Government of India Act, you had the Congress actually forming governments in 8 out of 11 British provinces with the British. You had a Congress premier and a British governor. So they were actually in the government with the same power that they were trying to oppose. There was actually no freedom struggle, so to say, between 1930 and 1942. And now come to 1942, the Quit India movement. Now, Quit India movement was just preceded by the Crips mission, which was sent to India, and almost the many parties, particularly the Congress, had actually accepted the Quit India movement, the Crips mission. But it was the Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar who opposed it only because it actually allowed for all the provinces to go and merge with any, either with Pakistan or form individual, autonomous units or be a part of a federal union of India. So we would have had a bigger Pakistan than what eventually came about. But the Congress was
or
accepting
perhaps
that.
or
uh,
perhaps even a balkanization of India.
Complete balkanization, and that was what a lot of them, in fact, recently I put out a tweet which caused a lot of stir, where someone like a ev Ramaswamy Naikar, who is fondly called as Periyar in India, was actively advocating for Dravidistan, all complete, all the states of South India to become a separate country called Dravidistan. Dr. Ambedkar himself wanted separate, country status for depressed classes. So there was a balkanization idea across, and of course Jinnah wanted Pakistan. And individual princely states, if they were given the option to go to any part of whatever they wanted to choose, you could have imagined what would have happened to the shape of the Indian Union, so to say. And the Congress was accepting this proposal only because they were being offered the defense portfolio. It was almost a known fact in 1942 during the Crips mission that Jawaharlal Nehru would perhaps be India's first defense minister. But then Gandhi put a spanner in the works. The Crips mission failed, and immediately after that, to almost all, kind of put his foothold on the Congress back, Gandhiji launched the Quit India movement in August with this cry of do or die. Now, it faced very stiff opposition within the Congress itself. The Congress president then, Maulana Azad, he says, and I quote him extensively in the book, that there was no plan of action, there was no program. It was just launched without any thought. And even by Gandhiji's own standards, this was something that had very limited outcome that was planned to it. And the British crushed the movement in 3 months, just 3 months. And within 2-3 days of the movement being launched, Gandhi and the entire Congress top brass was arrested and taken away to all the fancy, palaces, Aga Khan Palace or the jails and so on. And so the movement actually was leaderless. It had
So it wasn't just Veer Savarkar, even Maulana Azad, various others opposed the
Rajgopalachari. So Rajaji,
Rajaji, yeah.
yeah, Rajaji, who was the left-hand man of Gandhi, he himself writes, and I've quoted him again, where Gandhi had
Are
this.
you
Sorry.
are you mischievously calling Rajaji the left-hand man because he was pro-capitalist policies? But okay, but sorry, coming back. Sorry. Carry
You
on,
are
please.
reading between the lines, Amish, as always. I shall leave it to
Sorry, carry on.
the
Sorry, carry on. Yeah.
So Gandhi had this very, very weird kind of a suggestion to the British that leave India, but leave your army behind. And Rajaji, who supported Gandhi in every act of his, and someone, Rajaji, who spearheaded the Pakistan plan. Even before Jinnah wanted it, the Madras legislature had passed a proposal saying, let us give Pakistan to Jinnah. Even before Jinnah could even think of Pakistan, the Congress was willing to hand over Pakistan to them on a platter. Even Rajaji calls this whole plan that the civil government, the British civil government leaving India, but then you have the army left behind. That was a catastrophe. And he calls it that. And he said it would be the worst form of British imperialism, where we would have a military government. India would have become a military base for the Second World War, with America, with all of them playing their game in Asia, with India as the base. So you can imagine what would have happened to the country. Ambedkar called the Quit India movement a treachery to the nation, and that it was a patriotic duty of every Indian to stay away from it and ensure that it doesn't succeed. So they were, and this was also the time when Japan was at our doorsteps, waiting to invade India. They'd already bombed some ports in Kakinada and Vishakhapatnam and Chennai and the port, coastal ports. So at that time, to create this kind of confusion within India, with no goal, mind you, saying, what do you want from the British? In fact, Maulana Azad says, Gandhi, when we asked him, what were your plans for this? He says, I have not yet planned. Let's just launch the movement. The British will then allow me to develop the movement. But the British were in no mood to pander to him anymore. In fact, when Meera Bain goes to meet the viceroy, she's not even given an audience by him because they've had enough of the old man and his antics. And they said, we are going to crush this movement. Only because at the time of the war, when you need communication channels, you need some kind of internal, peace. This is creating a lot of disarray in the country. So, and the movement, which was always thought of as non-violent, it actually turned to a bloody violent movement, the Quit India movement, because there were no leaders, there were no, as I said, a plan or program of action. And so, in the absence of that, this do or die meant many things to many people. Some actually took it to heart, and actually they were, rioting. They were picketing of shops. There were railway and communication channels cut off. A violent movement where underground revolutionaries also started coming out. There were rebellion, seeds of rebellion sown in the army, and that is what alarmed the British, not so much the non-violent struggle part of it. And interestingly, the Congress itself disowned itself from the Quit India movement because it had turned violent. And in fact, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his memoirs, again, I quote him in the book where he says, 2 decades of dinning non-violence into the heads of Indians did not bring any action, and they became so violent. So the Congress themselves at that time did not, they completely disowned themselves of any of the violent activities. And truth be told, they were not to be responsible because all their leaders were in jail anyway. So in such a scenario, to assume that this was the reason for India to get freedom, a movement which had failed, a movement which had no plan, a movement which had no leaders, which lasted for a few weeks or at the maximum 2 or 3 months, and it ended in 1942 in utter failure. And we got independence 5 years later. So were the British so shaken by it that it took them 5 years to actually assimilate the trauma of Quit India, and that's why they had to leave. So, like our dear friend Sanjeev Sanyal often says that we've been often made to believe that we kept politely asking the British, saying, "Please quit India," and they graciously said, "Okay, fine," and then they got bored and left. But that was not what got India her freedom. So, as I said, the Bagawat within the army, the revolt and uprising within the army, which the Quit India movement, led to or became, instead of the non-violent movement it was envisaged as, and also the activities of the Indian National Army of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, culminating finally in the mutiny in the Royal Indian Navy, the Royal Indian Army in February 1946. Within 3 weeks of the naval mutiny, the cabinet mission plan was sent to India to discuss transfer of power. And the independence was to come to us by August of 1948. But then the British were in such a hurry to leave that they left us in 1947 August itself, much to the alarm of many of the Indian leaders themselves. If you hear that famous speech of Dr. Ambedkar to the BBC in the 1950s, he does mention that we didn't even know why we got freedom so quickly, and that was one reason why the partition was done in such a clumsy manner. The transfer of power was in such a shoddy kind of a way where there was no exchange of population. There was so much of mayhem, so much of disaster, because Lord Mountbatten was given the express duty that from the wreckage that is there, salvage as much as possible and come back to Britain, because the British feared an uprising in the army, because 1857 they had seen what that could cause, a carnage of British men, women and children, and they didn't want that to happen, particularly at a time when the Second World War had drained Britain's economy, resources and all of that, and colonies across the world were getting out of the clutches of imperialism. So a combination of these factors was what got us our freedom. So to say that there was just one stream, one movement which got us freedom, and anybody who did not subscribe to that are traitors to the country, I think that's a very, very dangerous and historically disingenuous argument, because that way then if Savarkar, who opposed the Quit India, was a traitor, so should you also say someone like Ambedkar or someone like Maulana Azad or even Rajgopalachari, who all were opposed to the movement. But eventually in the Congress, it was a my way or a highway kind of a thing. It was a very dictatorial stand where Gandhiji would go on a fast and everybody would have to fall in line. So, though they had made their opposition to it very, very clear, a lot of congressmen grudgingly later had to accept it. But those outside the Congress fold, like Savarkar or Ambedkar and others, they tooth and nail, they were quite opposed to the Quit India. In fact, Savarkar called it as a split India movement because that was what it was going to help. Because with the Congress out of the picture, the Muslim League got the complete confidence of the Viceroy. The Congress lost its bargaining power with the Viceroy. And Jinnah managed to cozy up to the Viceroy so much that he could get all his wishes fulfilled. And by the time Gandhi and others came out of jail, it was 1944-45, by then it was too late. The plan for partition and for Pakistan was already drawn by then. There was no way that the Congress, which could have been a very strong bulwark against Jinnah, against the idea of partition, actually relinquished its entire historic duty and responsibility to prevent a partition of the country and all the attendant miseries that were faced by our people, and probably something that we continue to face.
Fascinating. And one of the things that strikes me always, and I wish scholars such as you and Sanjeev and others would take up bringing out more of the revolutionary struggle
Yeah.
from the pre First War of Independence till 1947, over that more than 100 year period. That entire stream also needs to be brought out into the public square, and I wish there are more and more scholars who take up this subject, study primary sources, and give us books that we can read and like enlighten
Sanjeev is
us.
doing it, I
Yeah,
guess. Sanjeev is coming out with a book on the revolutionary movement.
fantastic. I'll look forward to that. There are a lot of questions coming up. We'll come
Yeah.
to that. Guys, please keep the questions coming. We will ask Vikram those questions. Vikram, if I can, bring it back to Veer Savarkar and ask a question that is often raised by
Mhm.
his detractors. That was Veer Savarkar casteist?
Oh my God.
It is raised as a question. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. On the contrary, the complete opposite of being a casteist. And that's against Amish, the kind of narrative. We had this infamous conference that was held, academic conference recently, so-called academic conference of how Hindutva needs to be dismantled globally and all of that. And one of the themes there was Hindutva is equal to casteism. Whereas we had the founder of the Hindutva, though I mean the term itself came much earlier with Chandranath Basu and others in 1890s, and Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, Dayanand Saraswati, so many others who propounded elements of that. But someone who gave it a political ideology, a philosophy of what it actually meant, Veer Savarkar, he himself stood for a completely casteless society, an elimination of not just untouchability, but all caste distinctions. So, and in those 13 years that he spent in Ratnagiri, in captivity, along with the underground movement that he and his brothers were doing to help the revolutionaries, Savarkar made Ratnagiri like a laboratory for his social experiments. He'd written this treatise of Hindutva in 1923 when he was in jail, where he spoke about a consolidation of the Hindu society, that all these differences that bog us down, how can we get rid of all of that and come together as a society? Now, from theory, it had to be put into practice. And those 13 years were what he dedicated to doing this very thing. Starting with, the 7 shackles that he spoke, which actually bind Hindu society together. Vedokta Bandi, where the Vedas are not the preserve of only the Brahmin community, but it is universal knowledge. And so it has to be democratized to everybody. And so, his thought was unlike Periyar and others who would say cut off people's sacred threads to eliminate caste in his idea. Savarkar said if the sacred thread is your passport to access the Vedic literature, let us put the secretary to everybody. So all the so-called lower castes, untouchables, he would conduct mass upanayans to all of them and say, now you're free, and I'm a Chitpavan Brahmin. I have the authority to conduct your Yajñopavit Sanskar. And so let's ensure everybody gets access to Vedic literature. Vyavasaya Bandi, the other shackle that he spoke of, where a profession is not something that you get based on your birth, but based on your merit. So there's nothing called hereditariness that is there. Then Samudra Bandi, where crossing the seas led to loss of caste as it was thought of by the orthodoxy. He was against that. Sparsha Bandi, untouchability, a complete elimination of that. Shuddhi Bandi, which was like, reconversion back to the Hindu faith, those who had been taken away either by coercion or allurement. There was no mechanism to, because we are not a proselytizing religion. So how to use the Arya Samaj, techniques of Shuddhi movements to bring people back. And Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, the intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. He started the first intercaste dining cafe in India in the 1920s. Now, at a time when even among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, you had the Chitpavans who would not sit with the Deshasthas and eat. The Konkanasthas, the Deshasthas, they would consider one inferior. There were subcastes. Here was a man who was a Brahmin himself, and much to the ire of the orthodoxy within the Hindu community, formed an intercaste dining cafe. And all his programs would be followed by Sahebhojan, where everyone would sit together and eat, partake meals. And the first temple called the Patit Pavan Mandir that was established by him in 1931 in Ratnagiri, where people of all communities could go and pray together. And there's a very, very, he literally several years of campaign to convince the trustees of the temples and so on to allow everyone. The Vitthal temple in Ratnagiri, where after a lot of convincing, there's this very, very emotional moment where all castes, they actually climb the stairs of that temple. And then he composes this very evocative poem in Marathi, which they all sing together and go up, saying, please shatter these false walls between me and my maker. Let me have a vision of my God. Why are you coming in between me and him? We are all Hindus. Let us go together as one race, one community, and one country. That also, and then the Asprishya Ganpati, an untouchable Ganpati, building on what Bal Gangadhar Tilak had done, using the Ganesh motif for rallying people together. So you have an untouchable Ganpati where the priest is actually someone from the lowest of the caste, and even the Brahmins and other upper castes had to go and touch his feet and then worship this Ganpati. Schools where children of all castes, including so-called untouchables, could sit together and study. Till then, a so-called untouchable student could not enter the same class to study. He or she would have to sit outside. And even if the teacher had to punish them, he would not go and touch them, obviously. So a duster or a scale would be thrown from within the class to those kneeling down outside or sitting outside. Finally, in Ratnagiri, you had the system after Savarkar's relentless, campaign, that children of all communities were sitting in the same classroom and studying. Today, these things may not seem much to us, sitting together and eating, sitting together and studying. But in India of the 1920s, that was a huge, success story to achieve. And importantly, Amish, the constant narrative that is fed to us was that the upper caste exploited the lower caste. And what Savarkar said was while that is true, among the so-called lower castes, there's a hierarchy of many subcastes, and each one dominates over the one below it. And even those differences need to be eliminated. And he writes that to Dr. Ambedkar several times, saying he was a Mahar, Ambedkar. And so the Mahars themselves exploit those who came below them, the Bhangis and Chamars and other communities like that, who could not enter a Mahar Vada. They could not enter a Mahar temple. They could not take water from a Mahar well. So while a Mahar would be exploited by the caste that came above him or her, the Mahar was no less. He was exploiting someone who came below him in the caste hierarchy. So Savarkar used to say that all these differences need to be eliminated till the last man in the last line of the caste ladder. He or she is allowed entry into temples, can take water from the wells, can go to the same schools, can go by the same tongas, all of that. And he writes several times to Ambedkar saying, I've done this experiment successfully as a pilot project in Ratnagiri, but my area of work is limited to this district. But you are a national leader. So why don't you come here, see what I've achieved, what we have all achieved, the Ratnagiri Hindu Sabha, and this can then be scaled up across the country. To me, Ami Sakal Hindu Bandhu, that was the poem that Omkar is really good at providing the important
Well done,
details.
Omkar.
That was something that Ambedkar could scale up for the rest of the country, and he said if we work together in 10 years, we'll be able to eliminate not only untouchability but the entire caste system. And this was again in tangent to what Gandhiji thought of. Gandhiji was all the time saying he believes in the varana system. He believes in the fact that there had to be these four varanas, which were uh, unfortunately, it was not how it was conceived of. It was based on your gunas and not hereditariness, but it had degenerated into that. But Gandhiji still believed that it had to be livelihoods. Could not you as a Kshatriya or a Vaishya, you could learn the art of a knowledge of a Brahmin, but you should not use it in livelihood. For your livelihood, you should still continue to be faithful to the Varna you were born in. And in fact, when a group of untouchables go to him to meet him, he says, not everybody can become a prime minister or a viceroy. You have to be born with those traits of leadership and skill and all of that to become a leader, which people like Savarkar and Ambedkar castigated completely, saying, why is it that we have to be born in a particular family or lineage to do what we do? And Ambedkar's constant grouse was, I can go to London, I can become a barrister, I can become a Brahmin, so to say, in my gunas. But according to Gandhiji, all I can do is be a scavenger, which is what my community would do. So I cannot earn livelihood by the skill I take. So what's the use of having that skill if you cannot use it in your life and make it better? So in the book, I actually bring together these very, very different contesting, philosophies and thoughts of Savarkar, Ambedkar, Gandhi on a very vexed issue of caste. And my assessment from it was that the views of Savarkar and Ambedkar were so much more in consonance in this field. And despite that, without knowing what the man did or what the man stood for, people call him or even the Hindutva philosophy as casteist, which is completely wrong. And not only Savarkar, the Sangh also later. Someone like Guruji Golwalkar in the inaugural session of the VHP in the 1960s, he said very clearly that among us Hindus, there's no one who's a patita. We are all sahodras. And he was also someone who actively campaigned against the
For
Varna.
those who, yeah, sorry. For those who may not know, Patita means pure. Sorry.
Or fallen,
Fallen.
someone who's fallen person. And he had this war of words with Karpatri Maharaj and the Ram Rajya Parishad and so on, which still believed in a traditional orthodoxy
Right.
all the time and so on. So I think these are very interesting debates to see how our national leaders viewed caste and what were their take on how to eliminate it, and do we need to eliminate it at all according to them.
Let's just jump into a few of the questions that are coming, and then I'll come back to mine in some time. So SK Kulkarni has a question. What is the relationship between Veer Savarkar and Dr. Ambedkar?
I think a very, very tense relationship because, as I said, I think Savarkar was constantly inviting him to come over and see what activities were done in Ratnagiri. For a very curious reason, Ambedkar never came and shared stage with Savarkar. During those 13 years he was in Ratnagiri, he kept giving some excuse or the other. He wrote a lot of laudatory passages saying, you are the only one who understands how the caste system can be completely eliminated by going to the root cause, which according to him was the Varna system. But he did not want to share stage. And that was because of the fact that anybody who associated themselves with Savarkar automatically came under British surveillance. And I think Ambedkar did not want to risk his own political career. And, he eventually went on to also be a part of the Viceroy's Council in 1942 at the peak of the war and the Quit India movement. So all of that would have been jeopardized. So he ensured that at the time when Savarkar was under captivity, he does not, share stage. But later on, they of course met. And interestingly, even when Savarkar was put on trial for Gandhiji's murder in the Red Fort trials, Ambedkar was a law minister then, and he attended the trial several times. And it is said, and I quote again, that he called up Bhopatkar, who was Savarkar's lawyer, and said, I want to meet you and come over at particular place, Mathura Road or somewhere in Delhi. And Ambedkar himself was driving the car, and Bhopatkar meets him there and he asks him to hop inside, and they drive a little ahead. And then he says that there is absolutely no case against your client. It's a completely fixed game, and he will win the case. And I'm saying this as the law minister of India. And the cabinet is also completely divided on why Savarkar has been made a fall guy in this case. And Bhopatkar writes, "My God, Jawaharlal Nehru, why would he do that? Was it to fix his opponent?" So I think to till the end, there was, of course, this tenuous relationship. They both came from Maharashtra, so the little bit of one-upmanship was perhaps there. But post Savarkar's coming out of Ratnagiri, I think the bonhomie between the two got a lot better.
Fascinating. Um, Omkar has a question. And Omkar, if that is your photograph, if that's how young you are, I'm extremely impressed by your knowledge and questions. But Vikram, Omkar has a question why Vikram addresses Savarkar by his first name in the first part and by his last name in this
My
part.
God.
Question
Wow.
le lo Guruji. Okay.
ठीक है sir.
I noticed something that I didn't, to be
Wow.
honest.
Wow, that's
Was it?
interesting. Yeah, I know. I don't know. Initially, I thought when Savarkar was young in the first volume, I kept calling him Vinayak. Though many people said, "How could you do that? It's such a blasphemous thing to do," and so on. But I don't know. A young Savarkar to me was always Vinayak, But then once he gets into the social reformer, politician, a lot of British records thereafter called him by his second name only, and the confusion also that there were three of them, the three brothers. So when I say Baba Rao was the elder brother, he was never called Baba Rao Savarkar in common parlance. Narayan Rao was also not suffixed by his surname, but Vinayak therefore became Savarkar, and that's the change I did.
Interesting. Amrit Bhargav has a question. How come only Veer Savarkar was sentenced to such harsh imprisonment? What actually distinguishes him from the rest of the revolutionaries? You have answered this in
Yeah.
a bit. If you do want to take a stab at it, or
Yeah, sure.
right? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say he was the only one who was sentenced to harsh imprisonment. There were several others. There were 100 other political prisoners in Kalapani who, like him, faced the worst of tortures. For all the talk of human rights, I mean, the kind of the bare human, facilities that should be given to a political prisoner, good toilets, good food, and medical treatment if you fall sick, even that not being provided to them, that Koluka Bell punishment where they had to go round and round to extract oil, 30 pounds of oil every day in that blazing heat of Port Blair. And if you did not, it would be weighed every end of the day. And if you did not extract that, you would be flogged and there would not be food to eat. And most of the food was with pieces of reptiles and all of that, and the political prisoners ate that and got diarrhea. There were fixed timings to go to the loo, and so if you had diarrhea and you had to go repeatedly, you were not given the permission. So most of the political prisoners would defecate in their own cells, and sitting, standing, sleeping, eating amidst your own squalor for months on end, not just a day or two. 6 months of solitary confinement, whiplashes, all of this that they all bore. And these were most of the hardcore revolutionaries who suffered the maximum in the Andamans. Initially from lot from Bengal, and then a few from Maharashtra, and then later on from Punjab, the three main epicenters, and then of course Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh, the United Provinces, and all of that. So I think they all faced these very, very difficult conditions, which several other leaders of the mainstream movement, I mean, they were put in lavish as I said, palaces and good jails where they got facilities to read, write letters to your daughter, write autobiographies, and so many things like that, which these people were not given even the pen and paper. Savarkar used to carve his poetry on the walls of his cell, sometimes with his nails, sometimes with a piece of charcoal. And to spite him, the British, the jailer, Barry, would come and whitewash the walls right in front of his eyes so that all those poems are removed. But this man had such an elephantine memory that he had committed all of those verses, not one or two Amish, but 6,000 verses, 6,000 verses of Marathi poetry, Kamala, Saptarashi, and so on, which he had imbibed. And after coming out, he actually published those poems. So that's the reason why the British government, gave this kind of hellish treatment was that they were scared of the revolutionaries. They really wanted them out of the Indian mainland, where even the tortures, the news of the tortures that they gave these people could not come to the rest of India. The rest of India did not even know what their compatriots were facing in those dreaded jail walls of Kalapani. It was kept as such a close secret. So the reason for that is very clear, that these were the people whom the British feared the most. And Savarkar's role in the revolutionary movement, apart from, and as writers, both of us should feel very happy that the pen is mightier than the sword, that the British actually feared him not because he wielded a weapon. He never held a gun in his life ever. It was for the power of his pen. The writings were considered so seditious. His became, I think, the world's first book, which got banned even before it was published. The book on 1857, which the Viceroy of India said this should not touch the shores of India. And they put the Sea Customs Act to ensure that that manuscript never comes to the country, because it had the potential to stir generations of revolutionaries, and it actually did. It became a Bible of sorts for Bhagat Singh later, for Sukhdev, Rajguru, for Netaji, Raj Bihari Bose. In fact, Bhagat Singh would use the 1857 book as a entry criteria for all those revolutionaries who wanted to join the HSRA. So Savarkar's role in this movement was the intellectual fountainhead, someone who gave Indian revolution a kind of a structure, a principle, where he said the two main causes for the 1857 revolution, it was not those beef lards and pork lards and all of that, the cartridges. That was a very momentary, it was just the spark. But what was the underlying principle which led to this bloody revolution from Peshawar to Calcutta, putting the entire length and breadth of India under its sway? It was twofold, according to him, both Swarajya and Swadharma. Not only your own rule, but also for your faith, which is why Hindus and Muslims both came together in this movement to get the British out of the country. So, providing that intellectual corpus to the revolutionary movement, and not making it, as we are all made to believe, spurts of foolhardy attempts by young people, but actually a very well coordinated, plan, where other important, inspiration that he took was from the Italian revolutionaries like Mazzini and Garibaldi, who had the Young Italy. So his Abhinav Bharat, or Young India, was advocating the same thing. How do you infiltrate the army, the British Indian army, and then ensure that a lot of, after getting trained in warfare, after getting access to arms and ammunition, how can you defect to the patriotic side? And that is exactly what happened eventually. A lot of the people whom Savarkar helped recruit for the Second World War, many of them defected to the INA. They got the feeder circuit, so to say, to the INA. And as I said, that is what got us our freedom. The role of the military, the impending rebellion within the military, which could have unseated the British government completely. 2.5 million Indian soldiers in the British Army by the time the World War came to an end, Second World War, controlled by about 40,000 British overlords. Now, among this 2.5 million, if you had even a few people who defected, you can imagine how easily the entire British Empire, which was sitting on the foundation of the Indian Army, it could collapse. And that is exactly what eventually happened. And the seeds of that were sown by revolutionaries like Savarkar, and we just do not, acknowledge or even recognize this important trait to our freedom struggle.
As a separate sidelight, I have read in a few books of how bloodily the first War of Independence, the 1857
Mhm.
War of Independence, was put down, and the reprisals and killings that carried on for many years
Yeah, yeah,
uh, later.
yeah.
Did Veer Savarkar write of that? Are you aware of? Can you give our viewers some sense of the horrific violence that actually carried on for many years by
Yeah,
the British
yeah.
Army to put down that revolt.
In fact, the penal settlement in the Andamans was created largely for that sake, to people, to be sent to Kalapani, and the first set of maximum tortures of the kind that I mentioned. That was created largely for the revolutionaries of 1857. Either they were sent to Port Blair or they were sent to Mandalay, and these were the two places where the Indian bastilles, so to say, and public hangings of so many people, including the Mughal emperors. Sons and all of that in Delhi, whether Mangal Pandey and the way many of the others, whether Lakshmi Bai, Rani Lakshmi Bai, and so many others were killed in battle, and those who lived on were packed away to these hellholes to suffer the worst of ignominies. And again, those names to Amish are not even a part of our discourse. And when one goes to Cellular Jail, there's that huge marble plaque that is there, which lists the names of all the people who suffered there, right from 1858, 59 till the late 1930s. Now, just reading those names, I think it was such a evocative moment for me. I literally very very emotional coming back to my hotel room and actually breaking down that these are the our forefathers who gave their everything. I mean, with this kind of tortures that they suffered, so that you and I can be in an India today and breathe free air. And the least we can do is to show gratitude by knowing those names, by having that as a part of our syllabus, by having these names inscribed in every damn history textbook that a young student reads. But we don't even know these names. We don't even know who they are. Their I'm sure their family members, next generations are still around. So 75 years, Amrit Mahotsav. I mean, if there's somebody from those families, they should just be invited and honored. That thanks to their sacrifices of our forefathers, under the most brutal conditions, which the world never knew of. Uh, that was the cost, the price that was paid for all of us to get free.
And sadly, many Indians don't know today as well. I'd
Yeah,
read somewhere that the worst thing you can do to your heroes is to forget them.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
that is the way, and they don't ask you to stand next to them and fight with them. They know we are not as brave as they are.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
the
True.
least you can do is remember them.
Yeah, true.
Very true. Very true.
About that, I think there was that little while you just, I think you mentioned a very interesting point. I think
Hmm.
when Savarkar is going away to Kalapani, he writes this, and I'll just it completely corroborates what you just said. He said, climbing into that steamer to be transported for life was like putting a live man in his own coffin. Hundreds and thousands must have gone to the Andaman Islands during these years, and not 10 in a thousand had returned alive to India. Young men of 18, as soon as they put their step on that steamer, became old, and the shadow of death was visible on their faces. When a man is put upon a bier, his relatives conclude that he had left the world forever, and, overcome with bereavement, watched the corpse with vacant eyes. Even so, the spectators watched us as we climbed into that steamer and felt that we were dead to the motherland we were leaving behind. The people watching the scene fixed their eyes upon me with the same feeling in their hearts. I was dead to the outside world. That feeling was writ large on their faces. Really, I was being put on my own funeral bier. The only difference was that I felt what was happening to me, while my corpse would have felt nothing. Thousands looking at me in this plight were simply indifferent and altogether cold. They were looking at me as they would have seen any corpse passing along the road, saying, "Poor man, he's dead, he's gone," says the passerbys, and forgets him the very next moment. It was a pain to me to see them gaping at me, my own fellow men, countrymen that they were, if but even a single one out of these my compatriots was to come to me and tell me, "Go, my brother, go. I and others like me swear that we shall make India free and fulfill your vow," I would have felt my funeral as being soft as a bed strewn with flowers. Oh, I'm having
Wow.
goosebumps reading this.
Oh yeah, you wrote well. Let's have
Yeah.
one more question. Um, okay, Chandler Bing. Okay, how much is the reality in Savarkar, Veer Savarkar, supporting or having a soft corner for Hitler's fascist ideology? People do ask this. It's a fair question.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
No, to be fair, I think a lot of the Hindu nationalist movements, whether the Hindu Mahasabha before Savarkar, it was Dr. Munje, who was the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, and he had gone to the Round Table Conference in London and then gone away from there in the 1930s, gone away from there and actually spent time in Italy to see Mussolini and also to see how that fascisti, the organization, how they had got themselves together, what the how the young men trained in arms and all of that. Um, and came back and tried to implement a lot of that. The RSS they had thought of should become a body like that of Boy Scouts who are armed, who are trained, and that was the fallout between the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, where the RSS said we don't want to become a militant wing, we don't want to be armed and all of that. We are a socio-cultural body, and we have an identity of our own. We can't become the appendage of the Hindu Mahasabha. So many of these Hindu Mahasabha leaders started their own violent, Boy Scouts, Ram Sena that Munje started, and Savarkar had the Hindu Rashtra Dal and all that, all very much modeled on the fascisti model of Mussolini. And even when the war broke out, Savarkar's own views was that it doesn't really, we should not be worried with all these isms and ideals, fascism and Nazism. It's for the Germans to decide if they want Hitler. Let them. It's up for them to have whoever they want as their leader. But he was like, we are supporting Churchill in the pretext of saving democracy in the world. But Churchill is probably more dangerous to India than Hitler is. And so, how does it help us to support the cause of a man who is so detrimental to India, the famines that he caused us in Bengal, and everything that literally drained India and her resources during the war? Supporting him for the hallowed cause of democracy
And
was of
millions died during the Bengal famine.
yes, Bengal famine. And so to support him to say we are re-establishing democracy in the world, I think that is a little fallacious. So the typical foreign policy principle of enemy is your friend. So if they are going to help you, then befriend him. And that's exactly what even Netaji did. The first thing he did was to go and meet Hitler. And Hitler formed the India Legion, an army within the Nazi group to fight for Indian independence. And then, of course, he went across to Japan and met Rash Bihari Bose, who had just formed the INA. But then the Germans were all the time a part of this movement to help India in her liberation story. So, to that extent, he had Savarkar, as several others, were appreciative of Hitler's help to India. But curiously, when the stories of the Holocaust and what they had done to the Jews started coming out, because in 1938, 39, when he had all these laudatory efforts, speeches to Hitler, the news of the
including in New York,
Holocaust was not.
including in New York Times actually. New
Yeah,
York
yeah,
Times wrote laudatory articles of.
correct, correct.
Yeah.
It was only later that when the news of the Holocaust became public, the leaders disassociated themselves from Hitler and what he had done, because many of them did not even know the horrors of the gas chambers and everything that went on. But till then, they were all having this soft corner that here were powers, the Axis powers, who were challenging global imperialism. And in that, the very fact that there was Japan involved in it was also an Asiatic power, which, the Japan had become such an important component of global politics, because in 1905, when they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was seen as that ultimate, pan-Asiatic force, which is why Rash Bihari Bose ran away to Japan in 1915 and stayed there. He married a Japanese, and this whole rising Asia against Western imperialism was was a dominant theme of that time. And Japan, Germany, Italy were all working in tandem, and so the fascination for that narrative of anti-imperial iconoclasts, I think that was very rife. And but again, that did not mean that they would have condoned the horrors of the Holocaust, but use a enemy's enemy as a friend to achieve your purpose. Don't be swayed by these lofty principles of democracy. That Stalin or Churchill is worse than a Hitler is, and so why do you have to support them in this hallowed goal that the Congress seem to have, that we are helping establish democracy but against fascism?
Yeah, I'd heard this very interesting way that was put. I'm sure you've read Animal Farm.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
the last scene, the animals at the window looking at the men and the pigs, and then
Yeah.
looking back, and then can't tell the difference, right?
True, true,
It was
true.
pretty much that way for us, the colonized. One
Yeah.
Western imperial power, another Western imperial. They were both. They may have been fighting with each other, but for
Yeah.
us, ordinary animals, they were both the same.
They were both the same. Yeah.
We couldn't tell the difference. They were both bad. It's not that one was bad and one
Yeah.
was some noble god. They
Yeah.
were both
True.
terrible.
And whoever helps you, befriend them.
Yeah.
So
So you look from the men to the pigs and then pigs back to the men, and you can't tell the difference if
yeah.
you're the colonized animals.
True.
Uh, Vikram, this will probably be the last question. I know you've given us a lot of time. Thank you for that, the Nehru
It's
Center.
always
So
a pleasure.
there's a question by Webs Gupta. I assume GPT stands for Gupta. Um, According to you, what are the three biggest losses India faced by the sidelining of Veer Savarkar post 1947?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Um yeah, I think the way he was sidelined, and the personal antipathy that Nehru had for him. I think with Gandhi, it was more of an ideological opposition, but with Nehru, it was a personal uh, antipathy that more Nehru shared for Savarkar. He did not even want to share stage with him in 1957 when the centenary of the 1857 war was being celebrated in Delhi. And so repeatedly, you had this Preventive Detention Act under which he was arrested several times. When the Nehru Liaquat Pact was being signed in 1950, he was made to give an undertaking that he will not talk anything about politics till the time the first elections in 1951 came about. Not only him, but the entire opposition. So you muzzle the entire opposition and then win an election as almost a unilateral power force there. So in after coming out of that jail and all of that, Savarkar was of course disillusioned. He did not participate, but still, I think the advice that he kept giving Nehru's government to be cautious about China, particularly in this whole optimism of the Panchsheel and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and all of those slogans that were going on right from the 1950s. We saw him writing, warning, after what happened to Tibet and the invasion by China, that India did not stand up to it, that India actually supported China in the Security Council to take on the position. He constantly kept attacking these things and said you need to be a little more strategic in your thinking. So that is one loss, I think, where our China policy is something that, and largely to national security and geopolitics, whether even it was a strategic support to Israel, and because that was, according to Savarkar, he was probably one of the few leaders who supported the creation of Israel in 1948, when Indian government itself took a very ambivalent position on it. And on matters like Kashmir, where he had a very clear, he and the entire the protege, whether it was Shama Prasad Mukherjee and others, who did not approve of things like the Article 370 and so on, where in one Ek Nishan, Ek Vidhan, Ek Samvidhan, and all of that, where there's going to be only one constitution, one flag, one prime minister. You cannot have a nation within a nation. So all of these very important aspects related to national security, India's sovereignty, are something that we probably lost on. I'd probably call him the father of Indian national security and diplomacy, where on that front, where I think we failed, without his involvement and expertise in that. Also, demographic changes in the Northeast that he constantly wrote about and said that could cause a problem to India, and he was proved right again with all the insurgency and secessionist movements that the Northeast of India started facing ever since there was a demographic shift in the population there on religious grounds. So on these matters, I think we could have gained a lot as a country if he was actively, even advising, and his advice was being taken by the independent governments of India.
So fascinating. As always, Vikram, wonderful event. Vikram Sampath, one of the finest thinkers in India today, finest thinkers and scholars.
Thank you.
He always thought through, always through primary sources, very often, makes you think. Whether you agree or disagree, the best scholars are those who force you to think and challenge your pre-existing opinions. I think you've done that very well at this event. Thank you so much, Vikram, for joining us. And for those who missed the display of the books at the beginning, let me do it again.
Do it
Uh,
again.
the books, as the team is helpfully displaying at the bottom, are available in amazon.co.uk. So do check it out. I'm sure you'll enjoy the book. Vikram, absolute pleasure having you here. Thank you so much. And I'm
Thank you,
just
Amish.
the storm
It's
did not take away the electricity.
yes, I think though it was a stormy topic, I think it is good, Amish, that we are actually discussing this in a mainstream manner today, and particularly a person like this who was a persona non grata. The fact that we can have a mainstream discussion in a venue like yours, and with a person like you, a scholar in your own right, and a fantastic writer in your own right, someone like that who could talk about, because I've often said how, in the 1950s, Pandit Hridaynath Mangeshkar ji lost his job from the All India Radio only because he tuned Savarkar's poems, and Lataji and Ashaji and others sang those poems, Sagara, Prana, Tadmadala. So in the 1950s, 60s, if we had mainstream discussions like this, we would all have lost our jobs or gone to jail. But today we are able to do this on a platform like this. I think that itself shows we've come a long way, and things have changed. Achhe din aa gaye hain. So and thank you so much for your constant support to not only me but to so many writers. I think the best thing that's happened to the Nehru Center is you,
Thank you.
a writer, a sensitive artist who's there at the helm himself. I think that brings a lot of changes to the institution. So thank you for all that you do for all of us.
Thank you. Thanks, Vikram.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you.